perhaps to get us started, the plan is that you and I will have a sort of like exchange for the next now 5 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A. So
Absolutely.
in the 4 minutes that we have left,
Right.
perhaps could you tell us, let's see, the elevator, I guess the elevator version of what the book is about?
Well, the elevator pitch is in some ways very simple. Right now, as we come out of COVID-19, we have to think very hard about what it means to be human in a digital world, because we live at an age when we are enthralled to technology. We all know that big data, AI, wonderful economic models, balance sheets, all of these tools which require on quantitative processes have given us fantastic navigational techniques for looking at the world and planning the world. But what my book argues is that culture matters too. And culture is very hard to define. It's a bit like trying to chase soap in the bath, trying to make sense of culture. But culture matters. It's really the context in which we operate. It's all the unstated assumptions and ideas that define us as groups, shape how we move in the world, and essentially shape how we forecast the future and look at the future. So as an anthropologist, I'm very interested in looking at how culture shapes business and markets and finance and people's lives. So what I've tried to do in the book is lay out a framework for thinking about culture and how it affects us. One of the taglines I use in the book is that in a world of AI, artificial intelligence, we need to think about another type of AI, anthropology intelligence, to work out how to use these tools in our lives more effectively.
That is so interesting, Gillian. I could not agree more that culture is an essential part of understanding business. Now, quick instructions for the audience. So the way in which we will be handling the Q&A is through a Q&A box that you should have on your Zoom, rather than relying on the text chat. So as we continue now, if you have questions for Gillian, please just ask them in the Q&A box, and I will be reading those questions out to her. And I see that some questions are already coming, but perhaps before we get into the questions, just briefly, Gillian, your career has traced this phenomenal arc going from being an anthropologist to suddenly being at the center of world capitalism in the Financial Times. Could you perhaps give us your own personal sense of how anthropology has helped you better understand capitalism?
Well, one of the guiding ideas in anthropology is that, to cite the old Chinese proverb, a fish can't see water. We can't see the cultural assumptions that are so powerful in shaping our lives unless we actively try to jump out of them from time to time, or if you like to use the metaphor, to jump out of your fishbowl as a fish, go and see other fish, how other fish live in other fish bowls, or ask fish in other fish bowls how they think about life. So what anthropologists have done in the past is go to seemingly strange or exotic or very different cultures, and look at how other people live, on the idea that an outsider can often see how other cultures operate better than the insiders. But increasingly, anthropologists have realized it doesn't just pay to do that in relation to other cultures, it also pays to flip the lens and look back at your own culture with insider, outsider eyes, if you like, to become almost a stranger in your own land, a stranger in your own world, to see yourself better. And I've done that in my own career. I started off as an anthropologist doing research in a place called Tajikistan, over on the other side of the world where I'd been brought up, just north of Afghanistan, really studying a very strange and different culture. And then later came back and used the same skills to look at my own world where I now live and work, which is journalism. I'm at the Financial Times, but also the world of Western finance and banking and business that's a lot more familiar to me. And the reason why anthropologists do that sort of outsider, insider perspective to try and jump out of their fish bowls and then look back and look at other fish bowls is because they believe that having that outside perspective enables you to not just look at the parts of the world that people talk about, the noise in our lives, if you like, the bits of our environment we pay attention to, but also to look at the silence, the things we don't talk about, which can be incredibly important. And so in my case, what happened was that I did my PhD on Tajik wedding rituals, looking at how these ceremonies expressed the culture and reinforced the cultural patterns and assumptions in Tajikistan. Came back and then used the same lens to analyze one of the great rituals of modern professional life, which was an investment banking conference. And many bankers might say, well, we're not like Tajiks. We don't have Tajik wedding rituals. But actually, an investment banking conference plays exactly the same role in the society of bankers as a Tajik wedding ritual. It brings bankers together, and it essentially enables them to recreate their social ties and to restate a worldview. And back in 2005, when I went to my first big European Securitization Forum event, I sat in the audience and deconstructed the great big investment banking ritual and saw that the investment bankers were operating with a very clubby, tribal pattern of thought, which made them feel very elite, very powerful, meant that outsiders couldn't look into what they were doing, meant they had a creation myth which was riddled with inconsistencies around this idea of liquid markets, but also meant they'd taken human beings out of the equation, and they couldn't see the consequences of what they were doing. And that led me to predict the 2008 financial crisis. And I subsequently used that same mode of thought and analysis to look at the rise of techlash, forecast the backlash against tech titans, to see the rise of Donald Trump in the 2016 election, to look at some of the issues around sustainability and ESG. So it's a tool which really can be used as much in the Western business world as in the world of Tajikistan, where I started my career.
Very interesting. And so what your career then really makes clear is that um, it's all interconnected, and understanding how native tribes in some corner of the world operate can very much speak to how other forms of tribes, such as the European Securitization Conference, behave and operate. There's a number of questions that I have on the chat, and I'd like to turn to the question raised by my colleague Netrapan. So Netra asks the following. Are you concerned that indigenous and underrepresented cultures from mainstream European culture will be lost as we move towards fantastical virtual worlds and 3D avatars? What's your view on this sort of like losing that diversity from indigenous and underrepresented cultures through technology?
Well, that's a really fantastic question. And I think there's a lot of people who are really concerned that globalization is going to wipe out a lot of cultures and turn us all into one great big cultural mush dominated by Hollywood or dominated by Silicon Valley, or whoever is creating the internet technology and culture. The reality is that that is certainly a very valid concern. It predates, obviously, the rise of digitization and computer science and all the amazing tools we have today. But it's very interesting how this cultural shift and globalization occurs for two reasons. Firstly, one of the things that digitization has done is actually enable some cultures to become more confident about projecting their identity and preserving their identity and actually coalescing together than they were before. And that sounds very odd, but if you look at how something like the Welsh language has been revived in the last few decades, or the Irish language in Ireland, which is something I know well because a number of my family are from Ireland and speak Irish, or look at how Romansh in Switzerland is being revived and preserved. Again, that's a part of my family speak Romansh. Internet tools are actually enabling languages which were dying to actually have a jolt of life. And it's enabling those communities to actually create newspapers, online digital newspapers, chat rooms, ways of actually celebrating their own language and culture. So that's one point. The second point I'd make, which is more sensitive because it taps into power structures, is that cultures never exist as boxes. They're always spectrums. They are always overlapping and changing and moving. And one way to imagine them is a bit like a river where new streams and currents are constantly coming in. And, you know, often in the past, dominant cultures, dominant societies have obliterated the less powerful ones. And that's been the tragic, tragic story of so much of globalization and the fate of so many indigenous peoples in the last few decades. However, I would say that actually there's some very interesting patterns of cultural fusion that can also take place. I tell the story in my book about Kit Kats, which is very important for anyone in the business world, where essentially Nestle bought the British company that made Kit Kat, a British chocolate bar, a few years ago. It was resolutely British in its branding, exported all over the world. It went to Japan, and there was a sudden upsurge in sales of Kit Kat that no one could understand until they realized that some local Japanese teens had taken the chocolate bar and turned it into a prayer tool using Shinto, local Shinto Japanese traditions. And the Nestle team could have just said, that's ridiculous. We're not going to have anything to do with it. That's really weird. Chocolate bars can't be prayer tools. And frankly, the local Japanese Shinto groups could have said, that's ridiculous too. In fact, what happened was Nestle lent into it and started marketing the bar in this way. And within a few years, half of all Japanese teenagers started to use the so-called British chocolate bar as a good luck token. And it became such a snowball effect that Nestle created dozens of different Japanese flavors of Kit Kat, like wasabi and Hokkaido melon and matcha green tea. And then it became a Japanese souvenir for tourists visiting Japan. And then it was exported back into Britain, made in a German factory. So today you can buy green tea Japanese matcha bars in Britain, made in a German factory from a company that's actually Swiss. So is a bar Japanese, German, Swiss, British, who knows? But you have a quite creative cultural fusion. And that is globalization at its best, when at least you can preserve different elements of those cultural traditions.
Very interesting how anthropology allows you to understand and read these processes of hybridity and interconnectedness taking place. But one thing that is striking, and this speaks to a question that has been asked by Imogen Parker, given the potential that there is for businesses to rely on anthropology, to what extent do you think, Gillian, that businesses have been willing to embrace an anthropological and human-centered philosophy? And to what extent are there barriers that are preventing them from doing that?
Well, I think that, and by the way, I see that one of the questions, before I do that, I'm going to quickly ask, I see one of the questions someone's asked, I'm going to jump in and answer it myself because it's a great one, is in what way has your research benefited the Tajikistan community? The short answer to that, by the way, is really two or threefold. I like to think that the sheer act of going to the village where I worked in, did my research all those years ago, gave them a tiny exposure to a world beyond where they lived. They had never met anybody outside Tajikistan, let alone the Soviet Union. And I think there was a tiny weeny flash of connectivity and, you know, opening a lens there. But more specifically, so that was the mountain community I work with, and I'm very much hoping to go back at some point. There've been a series of wars, and obviously with the COVID recently, to do many more practical projects back there. The community I lived down in Dushanbe, the capital city, I actually have subsequently been involved in a number of Silk Road cultural exchanges. And just to cite one example, you know, the granddaughter of the community I lived with actually came back and lived with me in New York a few years ago, and did an exchange program with the museum, with the Metropolitan Museum, and is very involved in trying to look at this incredible tradition in Central Asia and Tajikistan of cultural fusion and cultural memes traveling back and forth over the Silk Road over many centuries. So tiny question there, answer there. In terms of the in terms of the question about companies using anthropologists, the short answer is yes. In the last 100 years, companies have sometimes brought in anthropologists to study their customers and their markets, particularly when they recognize that their customers are behaving in ways that seem weird to the companies. So groups like Intel have brought in anthropologists to study how and why their consumers in countries all over the world don't behave like Silicon Valley male techies. Sometimes companies have brought them in to study their own workers. General Motors, again, a story I tell in my book, has done that too. What has generally not happened, but needs to happen, is for companies to flip the lens and look at how the managers and the people running companies are behaving and thinking, and to use some self-reflection there. I believe, or perhaps I hope, that is just starting to happen in tiny ways, but not under the guise of anthropology, but under the label of sustainability and environmental, social, and government ideas. Because if you look at what is driving the ESG movement, a lot of it is actually quite similar to what drives anthropology, in the sense that executives and investors are trying to widen the lens, take a bigger view of what companies are doing, and understand the cultural context and also the consequences of their footprint on the world and how they interact with the world in a social and environmental sense. So I think that although you could never say that most companies have grown a conscience and embraced a more human vision of business yet, many are indicating they'd like to move in that direction to themselves and their employees and investors, and often doing so in these ritualistic ways through kind of ESG statements and memos. And yes, ritual doesn't reflect reality, but it reflects an aspiration that right now I think is very interesting in terms of the changing of the zeitgeist.
Very interesting, Gillian. And also that explains your involvement in the Moral Money newsletter, which is, to a great extent on ESG. ESG can be as a way of an outside perspective on existing corporations and capitalist practice. I'm looking at the clock. We have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to quickly summarize 3 questions and let you choose which one you want to tackle. So my colleague Caroline, she's asking you about tips as to how to be an outsider insider. Guy Taylor asks about reading recommendations on anthropology. And my colleague Zachary Estes is asking you about the potential for bias that looking at feelings and the inside perspective in our community may create. So we don't have a lot of time, just 2 minutes left, but please choose which one you would like to address.
Okay, 1, reading list. I had a big piece in The Guardian, which went up about a week ago, which laid out a 10-part reading list. And there's also a long reading list at the back of my book. Bias, absolutely. Everybody has biases. Anyone who fools themselves into thinking they don't is wrong. There is no such thing as a clean microscope. So anthropologists have biases as much as anyone else. The only solution, though, is to recognize a bias, keep reflecting on your bias, and look for checks and balances. And that really addresses the last question, which is that trying to get a plurality of perspectives, being an insider, trying to make yourself an outsider deliberately at times. And again, I lay out in my book how to do that. And then trying to get a range of outside-inside views on a problem is so important. And it's something we've been forced to do because COVID-19 lockdown, the experience of going online abruptly to digital space and then back again, has in a way made us strangers in our own land and lives in some respect. So right now we have a chance to embrace that idea to get a plurality of vision, which at the end of the day is the only way to try and guard against bias, and to learn to listen to others to better understand ourselves too.
Gillian Tett, thank you so much for your time with us. A reminder to everybody, her book, let me see, Anthro-Vision, I'm not sure you can see it. Yes, Anthro-Vision gives you even more for those of you who have been interested in this idea. So thank you so much for being with us at BASE, and I look forward for more occasions to listen to you. Thank you, and thank you all.
And apologies again for being so late, and thanks for your interest. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.